Hey there, and welcome to the Airlock Module Podcast. I am your host, Yuki Nishimura. Think of this show as a cozy little airlock, a place where we pause, connect, and step between two worlds, Earth and Mars, science and everyday life, life inside the habitat, and discoveries out on EVA. Each episode, I sit down with an analog astronaut or the amazing mission directors, engineers, scientists, support crews who make these simulations possible. Together, we share the real stories of what it's like to live and work in a Mars habitat and the surprising lessons it teaches us about living better here on Earth. Today's guest is redefining how we think about mental health and human performance in space and other extreme environments. Dr. Laura Thomas is a chartered psychologist, co-founder of Parsec Space, and a seasoned explorer who has served as crew psychological officer on Mars Medics 5 in the Mojave Desert, a health and safety officer on Devon Island with Psychologist Crew 17, and a researcher with the B.I.G North Pole Ski Expedition team. Laura's passion lies in the intersection of psychology and technology. She holds a Master of Science in Computational Neuroscience and Cognitive Robotics, has published on the use of virtual reality as a countermeasure for long-duration spaceflight, and is exploring how AI-powered tools can help astronauts monitor their own mental well-being on future missions to Mars. Today, we'll talk about what it takes to maintain psychological health when you're cut off from Earth, how virtual reality can become a lifeline for astronauts, and what we can learn from these research missions about resilience here on Earth. So let's step inside the airlock and welcome Dr. Laura Thomas. All right, I think we are recording. Hello, Dr. Laura Thomas.
Hi, Yuki.
How's it going?
Well, it's going good. How's it going there?
Good. I'm in Seattle. I think it's like, I don't know, we're in the 50s now. I'm not sure what the temperature is like over there. You're calling from Calgary?
Calling from Calgary. So yeah, it's a little bit colder than where you are, unfortunately.
Is that where you're from originally?
No, I moved here officially about a year ago. So no, I'm from London, UK.
Well, you touched on it a little bit, but can you go a little bit deeper on what school you went to and the degree you have?
My undergraduate degree I did at Reading University, which is where I grew up for the most part. And that was in psychology and philosophy. And then a doctorate in counseling psychology, which was in Guildford. A little while later, I decided I really wanted a STEM degree. So I went back to university during COVID. That was the University of Birmingham, and I studied computational neuroscience and cognitive robotics. Lots of coding, computation, quite different, but very fulfilling.
Great. And that's a good segue into some of the incredible missions you've led and you've been part of. So you were a crew psychological officer for Mars Medics 5 in the Mojave Desert,
Yes.
researcher on the B.I.G or Big North Pole Ski Expedition,
Yeah.
and health and safety officer for, correct me if I'm wrong, is it Psychologist?
Yeah, and it's hard to find because it's a Nuktitut. Silalik is
Okay.
you say it. Yeah. That's my patch here.
Yes, nice. What first sparked your interest in space and extreme environments?
Yeah, so this has been about a 10-year journey for me, moving into the space psychology, human systems industry. So back in 2016, I was working in a private hospital in London. And I was working a lot with high performance professionals. I was working a lot with military and pilots. And that sort of gave me a good grounding and understanding of the people who work in those spaces and the kind of challenges they face. And then I started getting into adventure tourism. And then I started going to really interesting talks, learning about the kinds of psychological research that was being done in extreme environments. And it felt like a moment where everything kind of clicked. And it was like, yes, that is what I'm supposed to be doing. Over the past 10 years, I've just made a series of steps really in that direction to help propel me. So doing these analog missions and doing actual expeditions as well is all a part of that, to really understand from the inside out what people in extreme environments go through and face.
Curious if you've ever considered climbing K2 or Mount Everest.
A high altitude mountaineering expedition is 100% on my bucket list. And I have one in mind. It's just a question of whether it's next summer, the summer after, how it
Oh,
sort of fits
wow.
in with everything. So yeah, it's very much on my bucket list.
Wow. Let's start with your Mars Medics 5 mission in the Mojave Desert. You went through the organization called Mars to conduct this mission. And what was the purpose of the mission? And what was your primary role and responsibilities there?
This was a really exciting crew because it was 8 females, which from my understanding was the first time that crew composition had happened in an analog setting. And it was people from all over the world as well. We had somebody from New Zealand, we had somebody from Jordan, we obviously had some Americans, we had me, British living in Canada. So it was a really nice coming together of nationalities, and we had a big age spectrum as well. It was about working together cohesively, and my role there was crew psychological officer. So I worked really closely with the medical officer in terms of monitoring everybody and acting as crew confidant when conflicts arose, which is somewhat inevitable within analog missions that go beyond a certain time point. So all of the expeditions and analogs that I've been part of, we've always had some sort of pre-training period. And that's, looks a little bit different depending on the
Mhm.
company and what you're being trained to do. But yes, thankfully they all had that pre-training period. I mean, there's still a limit though as to what you can really achieve virtually, and that's not to downplay it.
Right.
There is no substitute for being in person with each other and just learning to live with each other and get to know everyone's habits and quirks and mannerisms and all that stuff. You just can't really substitute that virtually.
What was the duration of that mission? And what did your day to day look like? And what
Yeah.
did you guys eat?
So that was a 10-day mission. The day-to-days were pretty busy. We had a mix of different things. And honestly, cooking took up a lot of time as well. If you're cooking 3 meals a day for 8 people and you just got little stoves and very basic equipment, right? That kind of takes time. So we had a mix of research activities, presentations, outreach sessions, a lot of EVAs as well. So, and obviously that takes time to get suited up, go out and do whatever objective you've got planned, and then get back and debrief the whole thing. So yeah, it was pretty busy. We also had lots of sort of crew bonding type activities throughout. So, and one of the women on the crew was an artist, and she brought in some different workshops, sort of creative workshops that we did that acted as crew bonding. And it honestly, it really did help to break things up and make things fun. Like we had a painting in the dark. You've got your eyes closed and, somebody's in your ear telling you what to paint, and you're there on somebody else's back trying to paint it. And then, it gets sort of passed down the chain. So it was fun.
Oh, that's interesting. At Ilma, we one of our researchers did an art project where she measured our vitals and our stress levels before and after our EVA session and how art can de-stress. So prior to the EVA, we got our vitals checked, did our EVA, which was about 30 minutes or so, and then getting out of the spacesuit, we got our vitals checked again, and then went into the science module where we did about 30 minutes of unaided art project where we were given different media, whether it's, color pencils, crayons, markers, and just, drew whatever came to mind. And then our vitals were checked again. The paper is still being written. Just throughout that process, felt like this art task really was helpful in de-stressing or bringing the stress level down. Before we move on from desert to the North Pole, anything you wanted to cover?
Well, that's where I started. I've got an ongoing research project that focuses on positive outcomes of being in analog environments. So that's where that project really started. And it was a great trial for it. And it was a great sort of test run for it. So yeah, that's an ongoing project. That's also currently part of the world's biggest analog.
Oh,
So
nice.
Yeah, so that's obviously happening right now. I think it was
Right.
today, I think was maybe the first day. So people, after they've, been in the analog, it's a mixed method study, so qualitative, quantitative, and it's based on the idea of post-traumatic growth, post-experience growth. And it assesses what positive impacts you've noticed on a existential level, on a personal level, any sort of positive change that you might have experienced as a result of undergoing time in a space analog environment. So, yeah, that was the birth of that project, really.
So you said qualitative and quantitative. I assume there's surveys involved. What type of quantitative data are you collecting?
Yeah, so it's a metric that's been slightly adapted for an analog setting, but it's essentially the same thing. It's the post-traumatic growth inventory, the expanded version. And that's been used and tested in all kinds of on different kinds of groups and after different kinds of events. And it has been used previously in sort of space and extreme environments literature. Yeah, so that's the metric that I'm using from a quantitative perspective. And then I've also got some adapted questions that sort of expand on people's answers and looking at things like time and experience across different types of analogs and how that might impact on people's responses.
I'm looking at the map of world's biggest analog. Are you having all of the facilities collect that survey information? Wow,
Yes. Yeah.
that is
It's,
amazing.
yeah.
That's a lot of facilities.
People are obviously free to say yes or no, but I think my understanding is that every facility has signed up to take on my study. So fingers crossed, because that would be wonderful.
All right, North Pole. So, how did you get into that mission?
This was around that time back in 2016 where I was really trying to explore and understand and connect with people who operated in that space. The expedition leader, Felicity Aston, she's quite a well known British explorer. And she was giving a talk in London around that time. And she was talking about the Euro Arabian expedition that she had put together, which took a group of people from the Middle East and from Europe who went to the North Pole. And some of these women were the first people in their country to do that and venture there. So I went to this talk and I knew that I wanted to make this connection with her. So I did. We stayed in touch and I did 2 full expeditions as part of that team and a couple of smaller trips as well, like going to Svalbard to collect data for climate science. We did a 10-day expedition in Iceland on Drangajökull, which is the most remote glacier in Iceland, basically. This was all sort of leading up to the North Pole expedition, which we did last year. The North Pole expedition was scheduled to be 12 to 14, but because of weather and the uncertainty in the logistics, we got condensed down to, I believe it was 7 days in the end.
That's still a lot of time in that extreme condition. I assume you had to consume more calories than you did at Mojave Desert.
Yeah.
Were you consuming like MREs? I can't imagine you were cooking with like raw
You
ingredients.
you cannot do that there. You cannot. Your only option is to melt snow to create water to pour into those, yeah, essentially MRE packs. We did have a couple of sponsors who provided us with some meals, which was great. We'd have 2 of those meals per day, which was in the morning and in the evening. And then throughout the day, everybody had to make up and bring their own sort of snack packs, which was like a big Ziploc bag full of calorie dense, but also hopefully some nutritious foods as well. So things like blocks of cheese, salami, granola bars, energy bars, but also just sweets and candy and chocolate because they're really calorie dense. And, even being there for a week, it surprised me how much the cold, I lost weight during that week just through the cold, even though I was absolutely overeating, compared to my normal amount of calories. But it's amazing how much extra that takes.
The previous mission, you were a psychological officer. It's on par with the education, but for this one, you were conducting a research on climate change.
Well, there are a few different projects. So we had a microplastics project, which was collecting snow, ice, and water samples to analyze for the presence of microplastics. And we also had a project on measuring levels of black carbon, which that's one of the materials that really accelerates ice melt, because you've got these little black particles and they sit on the ice, and it just increases the speed of that melting. And then there was also a project looking at like the presence of heavy metals and in, again, samples of ice and snow. So that was the primary objective for the project. So all of us were there in service of that aim.
When you were collecting heavy metals, were you sending that into a lab to test for heavy metals, or did you have test kits there?
So our expedition leader, this was her big project. She was the one who was going away and analyzing this. And then there was another researcher in the US who was taking charge of the black carbon. Our job was to collect and preserve these samples, but also all the equipment and gear for that really takes up a lot of space. This is the added complexity of undergoing a research expedition. When you're self-supported doing a polar expedition, you have to bring all your own gear and supplies anyway. But then when you're having to bring a bunch of research stuff, so we had these 4 giant crates just full of sample containers. And obviously in that environment, it's so cold, they stay frozen. So you don't need to worry about them melting or anything. And in Iceland, it was much easier to melt things on site because the temperature was, yes, it was cold, but it wasn't minus 40, which, with wind chill is what it was getting to up in the North Pole. So that's quite different to sort of -5, minus 10 even.
So in your form, you hinted that you were once stalked by a polar bear. Can we hear that story?
Yeah, it's one of those things that we won't fully know, but it was scary. And it happened pretty quickly into our trip as well. So we'd headed out onto the ice and we were making good headway and feeling good. And when we'd arrived, the weather was pretty nice. But weather changes quickly and dramatically in those areas. A giant storm came upon us and visibility was really, really bad. And we made the decision, okay, we need to pitch a tent. We need to get safe and stay warm. But somebody is bear guard at all times in that environment because there are polar bears and there's a fair amount of them actually in that area. There were 4 of us inside and our expedition leader was outside being bear watch. And she asked for somebody to come outside for a second opinion. So I come outside and take a look because she thinks that she sees something. And honestly, the visibility was so bad. It was really, really hard to tell. But, we sort of stayed vigilant. And then she kept seeing something. So somebody else came out and they thought they saw something as well. So we made the decision to, okay, we'll pack up the tent and we're going to move a bit further inland because the polar bears like to be out on the sea ice where they can find seals. So we packed up the tent. That whole journey back, as we were going further inland, all members of the team saw something moving at a different location around us. And the visibility was so terrible. And your goggles are freezing over. You've got these tiny little specks that you can see through. And people are saying that, that I saw something. It's pretty scary.
Oh, that is scary. Let's segue then from the North Pole to the Canadian Arctic. Same question. What was the mission like? How did you get involved with that? And what was the objective of the mission?
So following my various analog experiences, I was invited to speak at conferences a couple of times. So the Space Education Summit. And I presented there on psychological innovations in spaceflight and extreme environments, and also on my analog experiences. So from the desert, the very warm, to the very cold with the North Pole. Terry, our good friend Terry, He saw me speaking and was very intrigued and really wanted me to be a part of one of these upcoming missions. So he's part of the Mars Society. So the structure on Devon Island is owned by the Mars Society. And every year they go out to this environment to study, to simulate astronaut missions. He invited me to come, and I was really excited to go, and it made sense. And yeah, it was really cool to see Devon Island. You know, this completely uninhabited space in the world was just I really loved it. I loved having the privilege of being able to do that.
What kind of experiments and research were being conducted there?
Yeah, so there's some ongoing research that happens there every year. So things like permafrost depth is one of the things that we took some time out to go and measure. But all of us brought our own research or projects to the mission as well. So I'll come back to my one because I'll speak a bit more about that. But Terry, for instance, was researching nanoplastics. We were all gathering samples for him, both water samples and algae samples, to see what was present there. Aida was looking at extracting water from gypsum, which is quite common in the rocks around that area on Devon Island. So we went out to various sites to collect rocks for her. And then our crew commander, Fanam, it wasn't so much research as her project was bringing her design background to change aspects of the interior of the HAP and make them more habitable for humans and just increase the livability of being in that structure for longer periods of time. So that was her stuff. And then for me, a different psychological project, but one that brought technology to the mix. So I was testing out this app that basically uses machine learning and AI to analyze various characteristics of your speech and your voice. So using vocal biomarkers is what that's called, to quite accurately determine aspects of your current psychological state. So specifically stress, fatigue, and burnout levels. And yeah, the use of the voice, there's really sort of mounting evidence at how powerful that can be, not just psychological data, but, you know, sort of health conditions as well. You can actually determine quite a lot from the voice. So I was testing a version of that app for analog environments. So it was a collaboration with a company based in London that I had known about for some time. I actually did some work experience for them a few years in the past, a company called Themia, and their focus is on developing clinically validated tools that use AI to objectively determine somebody's psychological state. And I mean, they do all kinds. It goes beyond kind of wellbeing data. So I was using a version of sort of the wellbeing tool. You know, they also look at depression, anxiety symptoms, and specifically what symptoms. And it's really fascinating how it can sort of break everything down. But yeah, we sort of customized together a version of this for analog environments and to use for my study.
Do you have any experience with Noah? It's an app that's available in the App Store. We used it at ILMA, and it was surprisingly adaptive. It adapted to our situation quickly. At the end, in my survey, though, I did provide a feedback because it instantaneously gave you a response. It felt a little too cold and scripted, but like I think it really helped with some of the situations that I was personally involved in during that mission. So great. Anything else before I move on from that mission that you want to touch on?
Let's see. It was interesting to compare, going from a crew of 8 in the desert to a crew of 4 on Devon Island. And it definitely feels different, I think, depending on the crew size. I still feel that, I still got very close to people who I was part of the 8 crew mission with. I've still stayed in good touch with most of them, actually. But yeah, it definitely does feel different. In terms of the roles and responsibilities, you really are taking on more in a crew of 4, which makes sense, right? There's half the people.
Yeah.
There's more to do there for each person. But in some ways, it does give you a good sense of what an astronaut team faces, because you might be having to pick up tasks that are not fully in your sort of area of expertise, right? But there's nobody else there who is available, and you have to do it. You all sort of have to muddle together. So I think the lines sometimes between roles and responsibilities were a little bit more blurred in a smaller crew, but that's no bad thing. It was just sort of a different experience really between the two.
According to your paper, the future potential of virtual reality countermeasures for maintaining behavioral health during long duration space exploration. The paper opens with the reality that Mars missions will likely require 650 days in space. You raise concerns about the psychological risk profile changing when we extend human spaceflight to this scale. Did you feel your mind drifting or experience any behavioral health conditions, extreme conditions like what you experienced in the North Pole?
I think there's definitely a shift that happens when you're against sort of chronic stresses. And, in the literature, there's this sort of, we talk about this as like the accumulation of all these small stresses lead and end up having a bigger effect. And I think particularly the North Pole expedition, I noticed a bigger shift than in the other environments. Devon Island was honestly really quite pleasant. That I mean, maybe that's because as well, because of my prior experience, right? Maybe I wasn't as phased by some of the complexities and uncertainties that we faced. But certainly in the North Pole environment, unless you've done sort of camping out in the snow, it's hard to explain how much longer and how much more effort just everyday normal tasks take. Putting on your jacket when your zip is completely frozen solid, like that takes 5 times as long. Heating up water to drink, 5 times as long. Putting up the tent, taking down the tent in snow and ice, like it's really physically and mentally grueling over time. And I definitely noticed I was becoming a bit more insular and reserved, which is somewhat normal. People have different ways of coping with things. But what I can say, and this is from working with many people who operate in extreme environments, everybody has a breaking point at some point. Everybody has, and that might be quite personal. Maybe there's some kind of triggers or stressors that don't really bother somebody else, but for that person, they have a particular significance or impact. And you put somebody in an extreme environment for long enough, doesn't matter how resilient they are, doesn't matter, what their personality tests say, they're going to struggle. We're human. We're not robots, right? Everybody has a breaking point if they're somewhere for long enough. I think it's important actually to lean into that rather than away from that. What are your vulnerabilities? What is likely to activate your breaking point? Because rather than sort of pretend that that's not going to happen, I think the more that you can be open to that and understand it, it helps you to mitigate and take preventative steps against that. I've worked with pilots, and it's a big thing in aviation where things are downplayed, but that doesn't help. Right? It doesn't help if somebody's struggling and they're still going and doing the job anyway. Isn't it better that there's some sort of acknowledgement and support put in place?
It's definitely important to understand one's breaking point so, you can implement ways to cope with that or identify it before it's too late. You mentioned through some of the stressors that you can lose volume in your hippocampal and prefrontal cortex. Is that a permanent thing, or can you regain it back through mental exercises?
I think in terms of the kinds of cognitive changes that can happen in space flight or in extreme environments, we're still sort of understanding the sort of the temporal component. And it does seem that, yes, some things can be reversed, but some things we're not as sure about as to how that recovery happens. So yeah, the study that you're talking about was looking at people who had overwintered in Antarctica. And because of the sensory monotony and just, every day the same thing. And there's a lot of white, and you're in this research facility and you're not sort of getting stimulated in the same way. And, if there's more isolation and stress that's built up, that's when you start to see these impacts. And interestingly, actually, a lot of the hazards of space. So, NASA breaks down these 5 hazards of spaceflight. So there's isolation, confinement, there's distance from Earth, radiation, altered gravity fields, and also being in a closed kind of capsule environment. When you look at research into those things, a lot of the times they seem to be impacting on the same brain regions. So the hippocampus comes up a lot, the prefrontal cortex comes up a lot. But they're kind of, again, you get that cumulative effect where those functions are affected. It's an area that we're still sort of unpacking and understanding.
In the paper, you make a case for virtual reality to countermeasure some of these behavior health concerns. If this were to materialize, or maybe it already exists, but what would the wearer of these VRs see and experience?
One of the projects that was in development that I thought was really cool, which I talk about in that paper, is Ansible. Basically, it was this big virtual world that was developed with sort of like a home space for astronauts to explore. And there were different sections of this building, and they could do things like catch up with world events, or they could go into a space where they could actually build something that looked like their home and interact with family members and friends in that space who were maybe leaving messages for them remotely and having sort of shared virtual meals together. And there was also talk about having these intelligent kind of social virtual agents to have new conversations with people, outside of their conversations with their crew who they see day in, day out, but to have new virtual people to interact with. And so I really liked that idea. And, having a private space, because also in an analog environment, in a spacecraft, you are so limited in terms of your space. And it's a way to feel like you've got access to a lot more space than you do. So that's what I really liked about virtual reality. And it can be private to you. And that idea of leaving messages for friends and family, that could also work with a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And you can virtually do exercises that help with things like reducing intensity of negative thoughts. If somebody's maybe starting to head that way, there's really cool things you can do to like physically reduce the thoughts on screen. So it's quite a cool way of working with that.
I can see how that would be beneficial. I really appreciate the time that you've given us. Where can our listeners find more information about you or follow your work?
We've got LinkedIn. So if you type in Laura Thomas Space Psychology, I will come up.
All right. We will link those into our show notes. Thank you, Dr. Laura Thomas. If you enjoyed this conversation, please take a moment to follow the Airlock Module Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave a positive review or rating. It really helps the algorithm boost the show so that more people can discover these stories and join our growing analog astronaut community. You can also connect with me on social media, on Instagram, Threads, and on X. If you would like to go one step further in supporting the show, I've set up a Patreon where donations are just $3 a month. Your support helps cover the monthly costs of website hosting, editing software, podcast hosting, and other things that help improve the quality of what you hear. Every contribution goes right back into the podcast. I will also thank every contributor at the end of the show. Thank you so much for tuning in and for being part of this journey. Until next time.